And we will be back with more on the Brussels investigation very soon, and also, of course, hearing about Theresa May going to be making a statement very shortly after Prime Minister's questions have ended. Let's talk now to our assistant political editor, Norman Smith, who's been listening to what's been going on at Prime Minister's questions. And Norman, you might want to explain, first of all, what the shouting is in the background.
Yeah, there's probably more action going on out here than there is in the Commons chamber. There's been a protest by a number of disability protesters here inside Central Lobby because of their anger. I'm sorry?
You have to stop. You can't film with this going on in the background.
We're not allowed to film this. Why not?
Because it's part of the rules and conditions of you using this area that you're not allowed to film.
As you can see, we're not allowed to film here, so unfortunately I'm going to have to terminate this broadcast.
Norman, thank you very much for that. We have been seeing some tweets from Norman and also from our political correspondent Chris Mason saying that people were being told they wouldn't be allowed to film any of that protest in relation to the disability cuts that was going on outside the House of Commons chamber in Central Lobby. But right now, let's go back to the House of Commons chamber itself, where Prime Minister
Over 1,000 people objected to the BBC that its coverage of the event was insufficient, including hundreds of emails, calls and tweets to Newswatch, although there is evidence that some of these complaints were orchestrated as part of a campaign. The Shadow Health Secretary Andy Burnham, who spoke at the rally, accused the corporation of providing only cursory coverage. Well, we've asked two viewers who got in touch to give us their perspective. Will Parbury, who's in our Bristol studio, and Laura Marcus, who joins us from Stoke. Laura, first, can you explain what you felt about the coverage, please?
Yes, Samira, I would have liked to have gone to the march, but instead I followed it on Twitter. And one of the first tweets I saw was from Norman Smith, who said that he'd been told that he wasn't allowed to record the march. So various people tweeted at it, well, why don't you get another news crew down there? Goodness knows there are enough of them in Manchester. But he just seemed to accept it when they said, you can't record here. He just seemed to say, oh, OK, then we won't do it then. And I can't understand who gave the order. I want to know who gave the order and why it was obeyed. This march was in a public place. There were 50,000 people marching against privatisation of the NHS, and it was barely covered at all.
Will, what were your concerns?
Well, my main concern was this march was actually a massive political event. It was actually much larger than Conservative Party conference. Once you strip out the lobbyists there and the journalists, there are probably only, what, 4,000 Tory activists in Manchester. This was an absolutely huge march. There were at least 50,000 people there, and it really wasn't given the scale of reporting that it really deserved. I mean, during the day, there was a amphibious bus which crashed in the Thames, and there were 30 wet tourists in London, and that was the third item on the BBC website. And this march was classified as local news in Manchester, and it really didn't reflect the scale of the event, because I mean this is the biggest march in Manchester history.
Well, there's a couple of issues there. One is about prominence, kind of comparative coverage, and the other is whether or not the BBC, failed to actually do its job in trying to report something that was going on. Norman Smith said, specifically, Laura, on the issue about security stopping them filming, that that's just what happened. That's all there was to it. Can you accept that?
No, absolutely not. I used to be a reporter. I was a cub reporter when I first started work. If I'd gone back to my news editor and said, oh, they told me I couldn't report it, he'd have sacked me on the spot. If you're told, no, you can't record it, number one, you don't take no for an answer. And number two, that is the story. That's a huge story. How many people know, watching this, that the BBC was told, we still don't know who by, you're not allowed to record and report this march? Who tells the BBC what it can and can't report? According to its charter, it's supposed to be partial and balanced. To not report on a huge news event that somebody tried to stop them from reporting is itself a news story.
Well, the BBC, we did ask to come on and debate with you, and they've said no. So they've given us this statement. The BBC has covered the protests against government spending cuts and NHS changes that took place in Manchester, with coverage across all platforms on Sunday, including the BBC News Channel, Radio News, within the lead story on both the News at 6 and News at 10, and a full report on BBC News Online. Will, what do you say?
Well, I think they're actually reacting to the kerfuffle on social media. They could see that people weren't happy, so they put it on later. But if you see a comparative event like the London Marathon, which is actually smaller than this march, it's actually covered for hours and hours and hours, whereas this was virtually ignored in reality compared with the coverage of all the party conferences. And there are probably more people on this march than went to all of the party conferences. There were more people on this march than are members of the Liberal Democrats or UKIP in the entire country.
Well, I suppose, we don't know what the BBC's editorial decision was, but the numbers might have been a factor, the fact that it was peaceful, and the fact maybe that the law has already changed on these NHS reforms. The rally wasn't going to change anything, and perhaps those all feed into a sense of it got some coverage, but it wasn't as prominent as people who were on it might have liked.
If this was a violent march, then there'd be absolutely tons of cameras there. These were people who were actually doing the right thing, and they should have got a fair share of coverage, really.
Laura.
The changes to the NHS are still ongoing and the BBC's barely covered it. And Andy Burnham, the Shadow Health Secretary, former Health Secretary, has gone on record to say that they're going to reverse these changes. They're going to reverse the privatisation of the NHS. It's a huge story. Loads of people are absolutely furious and really, really worried and upset about what's going on in the NHS. It would have made fantastic TV coverage. It would have been really good, and it was completely ignored. It's no good saying it's on all your platforms. For most people in this country, a platform is something you catch a train from. People get their news in the main from the BBC. They rely on it, they trust it, and they look to it to tell them what's going on, and it didn't tell them what happened on Sunday. This is a gross error from the BBC.
Laura Marcus and Will Parbury, thank you both very much.